So let's look at this data set here. So this is a very, very famous data set which was published a while back now by Greg Bogdanis, in fact, when he was based at Loughborough University, and this is part of his PhD work. And what they've done here is they've got 30-second cycle sprints, so Wingate tests. And what they've recorded is the metabolites, these muscle biopsies they used here. And they've recorded these immediately after the sprint, and then at minutes 1 to 5, so it's kind of in that range, and then 3 minutes and 6 minutes post the Wingate intervention. And the reason for showing these is really just to reflect, not in terms of kind of how a recovery intervention was used, but looking at what happens if we don't have a recovery intervention. So, for example, if we take muscle glycogen, remember it's a 30-second Wingate test, so there is clearly some anaerobic metabolism going on using substrate level glycolysis. So we've got quite a significant decline. You'll notice there is a restoration, but very slight, in this first 1 to 5 minute boundary, and in fact it's only marginally better at 3 minutes, and actually at 6 minutes we've still got no restoration. So 6 minutes post exercise with no formal recovery process, we haven't got anything. Remember, this is all kind of passive. Let's take PCR, so the phosphocreatine content. Not surprisingly, it's a high intensity sprint. So we've gone from a value of 77.1, don't worry about the units, to 15.1, but we've actually got a reasonable restoration in about 1 minute. And we're starting to get back after 6 minutes, close, but not absolutely where we would expect to be, but close to where we would anticipate having been in terms of our resting values. Now, the thing that Bogdanis is kind of basing this on in many ways is there was some really early work done by a group of guys out in Canada, Bonin and Belcastro, and this was in the late 70s, and they were looking at restoration rates of PCR. And what they were showing was that, under optimal conditions, and we'll talk about optimal conditions in a moment, you get a rate of restoration of around about 50% restoration in around about 1 minute. Well, it looks like we're getting close to that, doesn't it? We're getting fairly close to that here. And then around about 85% at 6 minutes. So it kind of conforms to what Bonin and Belcastro were referring to. So this is the concentration of free creatine. So this is because the phosphate has been cleaved from the phosphocreatine and donated to ADP, gives ATP. So what can we see? Well, the free concentration has gone up, but actually in line with the restoration of the PCR, we're starting to get it, but we still haven't got full restoration within 6 minutes of recovery. If we look at the ATP concentration, there's very little change, and that's again important to understand, and we'll cover these in another session, which is about the principles of and the motions of fatigue, is that really the ATP concentration shouldn't change, because fundamentally you're using substrates to resynthesize the ATP. The final one we'll just look at very quickly is lactate. So again, don't worry about the units, but we've gone up from 3.8 to 119 in 30 seconds. But you'll notice that even after 6 minutes, you've barely got any lactate clearance. So this is a really good indication of what happens when we don't have an appropriate recovery in place. We're not getting substrate regeneration. We're not getting a removal of lactate. Although lactate in itself is perhaps slightly benign, it clearly implies that we have not got full clearance in terms of our hydrogen ion concentration and the kind of the rampant effects that has. So it's a very, very useful starting point for us. So if we then come forward a little bit, so what we've got here is data, and again it's reasonably old data from 2004, and you've got data. It's pre and post exercise, and it's separated by 15 minutes of low intensity cycling, so this is 40% VO2 max, which is active recovery, or the passive recovery. So very much kind of what we saw with the previous slide from Greg Bogdanis. And what they've got for us is ATP, free creatine, and phosphocreatine concentration. So look at the passive. So the passive here. So it's high intensity exercise. So it's really high intensity, a bit like the. So if we look at the PR, which is the passive recovery data, again, kind of confirming what we saw with Greg Bogdanis' data in the previous slide. So if we look, so it's pre-bout 1 to post-bout 1, and then if we look at it kind of what happens, so the ATP concentration hasn't really changed. The PCR concentration, not surprisingly, has declined significantly. And actually what is interesting, even with the passive recovery, they seem to have got some degree of restoration, which I think that's quite interesting in its own right. When you go to the free creatine concentration, yeah, it's increased, and it's decreased again in the passive recovery, fairly similar to what you would see, at baseline. So what's happened at active recovery? Well, active recovery, again, no change in the ATP. But it's interesting that the free concentrations increase at pretty much to the same degree, but the restoration, actually, it's not quite as good. It's fairly similar. It's not quite as good, perhaps, as we saw with passive recovery. And if we look at the phosphocreatine concentration, we've got pretty close to restoration, but not as good, really. I mean, it looks like we've gained more here, but not as good as we got with the passive recovery. So you go, well, why is that the case? Because surely that the notion that most people understand is that we do active recovery because active recovery is good. So is this saying that active recovery isn't good? It's not. What it is actually saying is that the intensity of active recovery has to be appropriate. And this is really important. They prescribed 40% of VO2 max. Now, you have to be slightly careful because there isn't real world application of that with an athlete. How do you prescribe 40% of VO2 max? But it tells us something really important, which goes back to that paper I mentioned earlier on, which is the Bonin and Belcastro paper. The Bonin and Belcastro paper demonstrated that they got the most efficient and actually the fastest rate of PCR restoration and lactate clearance when the recovery was actually at around about 140 beats of heart rate per minute. And it was actually less effective at 150 beats. In fact, they showed some kind of lactate accumulation, and very ineffective at about 110 beats per minute. So where does that tie in? Well, the simple truth is 40% VO2 max is almost certainly way too low in terms of the intensity. So we have to explore, well, why is that too low? Why is that not being effective? Why is it no better, or no worse, but certainly no better than a passive recovery, when actually what we want to do is get a much, much faster rate of recovery? Well, if we look at this in this data set here, and this is from Jens Bangsbo. So what they've got is they've got an active leg and they've got a passive leg. So what they've had the participants do is they've done intense cycling exercise, and then they've had them going into recovery. And they've had one leg which is kind of an active leg and one leg is passive. In other words, they're able to compare inter and intra analysis here. It's very clever in terms of the way the study is done. So here's the kind of the resting values. So we've got resting values for muscle glycogen, which they haven't got for both legs. They've only got it for, they've taken an average across the legs. It's not clear, by the way, which leg that is for. But if we look at, say, the creatine, the ATP, and the inosine monophosphate, if we go, okay, let's look at, say, lactate now. So we look at lactate in the active leg at rest, and then we look at it immediately after exercise. You can see there's a significant increase. Now what you start to see is at 3 to 4 minutes, and then about 10.8 minutes, you can see we're starting to get lactate clearance. It's still, it's still there. It's still, still not fully cleared, but we're getting lactate clearance. If we look at the creatine phosphate concentration, not surprisingly, you can see that we're getting a restoration of the creatine phosphate. In fact, actually, after about 10 minutes, we've got full restoration, and the ATP concentration doesn't change. So it's kind of reinforcing what we've seen in the previous slides. Now, excuse me, the missing link here is, well, how intense is the recovery that we've used? Because you could see in the previous data set, and you could see from the inference I made from the Bonin and Balcastro work, that unless this intensity is correct for the active recovery, you don't prosper. Well, we can probably connect all this together and actually show why that previous data set didn't really produce any benefit in terms of what we're expecting to see. Well, you can see that this chart is building itself here, and we've got our key points here, which are our lactate threshold and our lactate turn point, and we've now highlighted what is called critical speed onto the graph, and we can see now that there are 4 zones, and you can see the VO2 max that has appeared. Now, fundamentally, what we start to understand, these are based on the lactate kinetics, is we've got 4 training zones. And this is where we really start to get into this understanding about what we're interested in, which is an active recovery. An active recovery has to be below the lactate threshold. Now, what does that work out as a percentage of VO2 max? It's actually in the region of probably 50 to 60% VO2 max. This is about 80% VO2 max here, and this is getting around about 85% VO2 max here. The key to understand is you can see what happens in the blood lactate concentration. As you move from the lactate threshold to the lactate turn point, although we are not getting a significant accumulation of lactate, lactate is rising. So the rate of appearance is actually being matched to disappearance, but we are getting lactate appearance. Now, we're using lactate here as our proxy indicator of fatigue. Remember, lactate isn't fatiguing, but it does indicate for us an increased rate in things like glycolysis. So what we actually understand is that the recovery needs to be as close to this point, not above it, as close to this point below it as you can get to get optimal lactate clearance, optimal restoration of PCR. Why? Because fundamentally it's about oxygen delivery. It's a balance. If we go into this zone here, although we're in this kind of classic moderate domain where we've got VO2 reaches a steady state in around 3 to 4 minutes, that's fine, and that, you get a high rate of oxygen delivery. But if you're at anything higher than that, and you go into this domain here, we incur a bigger O2 deficit. It's going to cost us. If we're actually working at too lower intensity, say right down here, we haven't got enough oxygen being delivered to the muscle. And remember, the restoration of PCR, the conversion of lactate back to pyruvate, as just 2 examples, are oxygen-dependent processes. So we know that active recovery works, but it has to be at the right intensity. And then actually the duration of that active recovery is then linked to that work from Bonin and Balcastro and the work from Greg Bogdanis that you saw, and in fact that work that you saw a moment ago from Jens Bangsbo, which is really no more than about 10 minutes at that intensity, seems to be optimal in terms of getting those recovery and regeneration processes operating. So active recovery is clearly the most utilized approach by non-athletes, athletes, and even clinical population groups in terms of at a training session. But what about alternate means?